Scores of missiles have evaded Ukraine's defences and struck targets across the country. The Russians, well, they targeted energy infrastructure, power lines, power plants, including one nuclear, plunging hundreds of thousands into cold and darkness. But plenty of civilian targets were also destroyed, either by accident or design. And frankly, it's happened so often now, the assumption has to be they were targeted intentionally. Still, the Russians claim the barrage was in response to what they described as a terrorist attack on Russian territory in Bryansk. Others point to the bloody entrenched battles around Bakhmut on the eastern frontier. The Russians have lost tens of thousands of troops attempting to take and hold a town not exactly thought of as desperately strategically significant. With the tempo of the conflict expected to accelerate significantly as the country comes out of winter, we appear no closer to a conclusion than on day one of the war. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily. Our chief correspondent, Stuart Ramsey, was in Kyiv when the attack took place.
Ukraine is never going to give up. I just think that this could go on forever, but they're just not going to give up.
We will be hearing much more from him shortly. But the story of the day is that barrage of missiles that struck across the country. We were sent this voice note from Ukrainian MP Andrei Ozadchuk, who's in Kyiv.
We had another mass missile attack on Ukraine. The officials are reporting that more than 13 regions were under attack. Kyiv is one of them. It was in early morning. It was pretty loud, as officials said that air defense was actively working. A number of missiles were shot down, but unfortunately some missiles reached targets. I was at home in this Kyiv downtown. They continue hunting on civilians, only they continue targeting civilians. But now we know that it is the nature of a horrific Kremlin regime. I'm sure that we will stay strong, and I'm sure that none of further missiles can change anything in Ukraine, and especially of our readiness to fight till the end. And we see that the victory is not our wish, it's upcoming reality.
Let's bring in our chief correspondent, Stuart Ramsey, in Kyiv. Stuart, sounds like a hell of a morning.
This has been a pretty big attack by the Russians on Ukraine. 81 missiles of various descriptions fired across an awful lot of the country. The aim of these attacks in the past has been to go for the energy infrastructure of Ukraine, to try and break down normal life, upset the population, if you like. But a large number of residential areas and actually even farmhouses were hit as well. I've just come back from one residential area. There's about 5 or 6 completely burnt out cars from where the missiles struck and started a fire which spread between all of those vehicles. Dozens upon dozens of apartment windows, as you might expect, have been smashed or cracked from the force of the blast. And people, I was asking them, are you getting used to this? It's gone on for over a year now. Is the war something that you just accept is happening? And actually, they say they're not getting used to it. They live in fear at night and they're angry about what's happening. But not one person I've spoken to has shown any doubt that it's the right thing that Ukraine keeps fighting. And it's sort of, they hope there's going to be peace. But then they accept that even as ordinary citizens, woken in the early morning by a huge explosion, it is something that just happens to them and they just got to accept it.
But is terrorizing the civilian population still, a major part of the Russian strategy? They do not have infinite numbers of missiles, and for them to be, we presume, targeting these places, they're clearly hoping still that it would have that effect.
We're hearing from the Ukrainian authorities that hypersonic missiles were used. Now, President Putin often talks about them because he describes them as the missile that NATO can't beat. In fact, nobody can beat because the speed that it travels, it can't actually be shot down. But he doesn't actually have that many. In the past, there's been greater power outages than we saw from this particular series of attacks. So it may be that their air defense systems are just continuing to improve so they could stop the severity or the implications from any attack from Russia. But it is wanting, as you say, to try to wear the Ukrainian people down. And I have to say, it simply isn't working. Why was a delay for 3 weeks? Well, one theory was that maybe they're running out of weapons. Maybe that's the case. Difficult to know, but certainly this was a very significant event by the Russians. And it's not that it completely unexpected, just I think after 3 weeks of relative quiet across the country, it always comes as a shock to the ordinary people.
Stuart, you've mentioned the targeting of infrastructure, particularly the power infrastructure. How concerned should we be that the electricity has been cut off to the nuclear power plant at Zaporizhzhia?
There is huge concern about the power plant. It's running on generators at the moment because it's been cut off from the grid. And obviously, nuclear power plants have to have electricity continuously so that they can keep the reactors cool. That's just an accepted given worldwide. Its diesel generators can keep going for 10 days. The position seems to be that power can be reconnected and it can be fixed. Both sides have accused the other of attempting to bomb it or not look after it correctly. And it is very, very serious. I mean, obviously, without power, you get a meltdown. It's the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe. And it really has to be secured somehow. But in this dreadful war, trying to get agreement between these two sides is nigh on impossible. And so the hope is that at some point, everyone will see sense and that actually it is left alone by all sides and no soldiers are even near it and nobody tries to attack one another around it. But there's not been much sense talked in this war, particularly from the Russians who basically have soldiers there. They know by definition that is going to be an antagonistic position against the Ukrainians. And both sides are effectively ignoring the authorities who really need to be able to control what happens to that nuclear power station, because obviously by definition, this would be a huge, huge incident for the whole of Europe, actually, and Russia, if it was to melt down.
We have heard from President Zelensky for quite some time. I want more. He wants more in terms of air defence. He certainly wants to get his hands on some fighter jets.
As you might expect, he basically criticised the Russians for attacking the civilian population of the country. He said, what you don't understand is that we're not going to give in, but you are trying to terrify people, trying to kill them, and that there will be effectively no surrender from Ukraine under any other circumstances. And I think what the point you're making actually is that these type of incidents, at the very least, by definition, if you think about it, when he asks for air defence, that's obviously a safety capability for the country. The donor nations are going to supply it because you need to be able to take these rockets, missiles and drones out of the sky. When it comes to other more sophisticated weaponry, where we know tanks are pretty much on their way, will he get fighter jets? He certainly thinks so. He knows there's a fair amount of convincing to do, but he definitely believes that eventually he will need them, and that will be a game changer. I suspect it probably could be, but crucially, they need huge amounts of munitions. They just actually need bullets and rockets of their own. And of course, at the same time, Russia does as well. And that's why we're seeing, I think, along this sort of 600-mile front line, there's a lot of fighting taking place, but a lot of the time it's actually almost ground to a halt. Now, some of that's to do with the weather, but mainly I think it's because both sides are conserving their weapons for any future offensives they may want to carry out. And the Ukrainians have made no secret that they intend to have one of their own come spring, and the Russians have made no secret that they are intending to do exactly the same, if they aren't already, in fact.
Let's focus then, shall we, on Bakhmut itself. Our team in Ukraine has also been speaking to those serving on the ground. First, Khalid Makiazo, a fighter in the Chechen battalion in the Ukrainian army, fighting in Bakhmut itself. We got someone in our newsroom to speak his words so that you can understand.
The city of Bakhmut is under full control of Ukrainian forces. There are Wagner fighters on the outskirts. Their units are trying to break through into the city. There is heavy fighting. The situation is hard, but under control. We're trying to stop them getting inside. There are civilians inside the city. They're hiding in shelters and coming to humanitarian hubs to get food. Sometimes we deliver food there. Also, there are bodies of civilians, and we're trying to find a way to get them out to Ukrainian-controlled territory. Fighting is very intense. They're shelling the city the whole time. They're located on the outskirts and shelling all the time. They're destroying all residential houses and trying to make a path for themselves. But for now, we are controlling the situation.
Now let's get an overview from Serhiy Cherawati, the spokesman for the Ukrainian Joint Forces Command in the east.
It's the epicenter of fighting. The enemy is using all its power in this direction on the outskirts of Bakhmut. Bakhmut is the hottest spot on the front line. The enemy is trying to break our defensive line, but they are failing. Ukrainian forces have been able to get ammunition and supplies into Bakhmut. They have also been able to evacuate injured people from there.
Stuart, why has this town become such a focal point?
Completely unremarkable city, to be honest, in the Donetsk region of the Donbass. And of course, the reason why it's significant for the Russians is because they've made it clear that they want to clear out and control the whole of the Donbass, which currently they don't. That is their objective. That was the objective right from the start. And they have failed so far to do that. In fact, the Ukrainians have pushed back. Now, Bakhmut now is of no great tactical or strategic value to the Russians, because beyond it, both to the north and to the south, the Ukrainians are heavily dug in, and from the south are planning their own offensives as well, and are pretty certain to be able to protect themselves from the north. Why are they doing it? Well, I think it's a lot of a fight between the Wagner group. This is the mercenary group that has, I think, attempted to show the Russian military that they can actually get a victory after sort of 6 months without any, and symbolically show them that they really mean business, and that by taking Bakhmut, perhaps the rest of the military get a G up, if you like, and that they perhaps helps their morale.
I mean, 20,000, 30,000 Russian troops have lost their lives in this battle already.
We think it's a case of sort of 5-to-1 Russian soldiers killed for every Ukrainian. And this is going on absolutely daily. Huge, huge numbers. The Ukrainian soldiers talk of the advancing Russian soldiers as literally stepping over the bodies of their comrades who have fallen in front of them. Many of these guys, these mercenaries, are actually ex-convicts. They've had very little training, and they're just basically being used in a very old Russian military tactic, which is you win because you've just got more people than anyone else. Well, it's not working here particularly. They have made significant advances, but they haven't been able to get the Ukrainians out at all. Now, I think what Bakhmut has become to Ukraine, interestingly, is a symbol of their defiance, and they really don't want to give it up. Again, it's not because it means too much to them. It's by no means the biggest city or the most important in that part of the country. So it really is one that they're just prepared to fight over.
What we're describing here, in entrenched, dug-in positions, wave after wave of attacks.
It does have that feeling of the Somme, doesn't it? World War One. And I have to say, walking through the trenches, it is quite an eerie feeling when you're doing it, because it seems, trudging through mud and snow. It feels very odd and very like, I can't believe now, 2023, that the pictures that we saw from 14 to 18, 1914, 18 World War One are actually being repeated in this modern era. But they are, and I'll tell you why. It's because they're using effectively the same tactics, and that is basically just to grind each other down with continuous artillery, and that's exactly what is happening.
You talked earlier about the morale amongst the civilian population that had been attacked. I wonder what the morale is like amongst the Ukrainian troops stationed in those trenches.
Very good. It's been going on for over a year. Many are clearly exhausted. They get, under a new law, about 10 days off a year, but all of them accept that logistically that is very hard to deliver on a guaranteed day and time, but they will get their time off. Some have not been home at all and haven't seen their families. And of course, a lot of their families will actually have left the country as well. So they're just sort of committed to the front line. I think we know on a battlefield that this is an actual simple fact. It takes less men, and it is easier to defend than it is to attack. So the Russians are much more likely to take casualties. And while Ukraine obviously carries out its own offensive expeditions as well, it's worth remembering that to them, it's always really about defending Ukraine. So even if the tactic is to attack, and it is more dangerous being on the offensive, they're defending their country. And I think you have an army and a volunteer army that believes in what they're fighting for, haven't been sent from another country, but are actually, if we lose here, then we lose everything.
Stuart, can you conceive of any circumstances in which President Zelensky would just give up, would just back away from what has been going on in Bakhmut?
I can't see any way. If we're specific about Bakhmut, yeah, he might well. He's already gone on record as saying, I'm not going to keep us fighting there until all of our guys, as he called them, are dead. He doesn't want to do that. But I think his advisors and his military have decided is that they actually can perhaps pull this off, but certainly degrade the Russians to such an extent, as I say, that it might be worth doing. But I can't see him, if you like, the whole battle. They're never going to give up. Ukraine is never going to give up. I just think this could go on forever, but they're just not going to give up. And I think there's too much international help for them to need to give up. The only way this comes to an end is some type of negotiated settlement, I believe. I can't see either side.
Now, that soldier's identity has still not been confirmed, but the mother you just heard said she is sure that it is her son. And it comes as we're getting new video into Outfront tonight that takes you to the front lines of that ongoing brutal hell battle for Bakhmut. This is a firsthand account of the intense fight taking place there. What you look at here is what appears to be a rocket-propelled grenade launcher fired, followed by the deafening sounds of incoming and outgoing gunfire. And tonight, we have new video of the attacks that Russians are facing from the air. So what you're looking at here are Wagner fighters. They're hiding in an abandoned home. Then that home, as you can see, they're hit by a Ukrainian strike, goes across. Those that survived quickly run to take shelter in another building. That building then is also hit. As we always say here, each one of these is an individual life that should not be lost because this war should not be happening. But it shows the reality of what's happening on the ground. NATO intelligence says that Putin right now is losing 5 men for every Ukrainian that is killed in the battle around Bakhmut. 5 to 1. And that may explain why the head of Russia's private army is dramatically beefing up recruitment efforts. As of tonight, Yevgeny Prigozhin says there are new recruitment centers in 42 cities across Russia. 42. According to a published document, the majority of the alleged recruitment centers are in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Now, these are the areas that have sent the least amount of fighters to the front lines, the wealthier, the more elite areas. All of that, though, this intense and massive recruiting effort is pretty incredible coming from Prigozhin in the context of him this week saying he doesn't have any ammunition and that former Russian military officials won't take his calls. He's been completely blocked. But as Russia continues to struggle with manpower, they've also seriously depleted their supply of sophisticated hypersonic missiles. Now, we know they've been using a lot, and the Ukrainian Air Force says that Putin used nearly 40% of his Kinzhal hypersonic missiles since February. And that would be very significant because these are Russia's most advanced weapons, able to travel up to 1,200 miles and fly at 10 times the speed of sound, which makes them virtually impossible for Ukraine to intercept, unlike many of Russia's other missiles. Let's go to Melissa Bell. She's out front live in Kharkiv tonight. She's been near the front lines. And Melissa, what is the latest on the ground tonight where you are?
Well, Erin, a difficult day along those front lines in the eastern part of the country. Out here in Kupiansk in the northeast of Ukraine, where we spend a lot of the day, heavy artillery incoming and outgoing. But all along that front line, those flashpoints again, seeing heavy fighting further south in Liman, as you mentioned, in Bakhmut, the worst hit of all. And this, of course, just a couple of days after Ukraine was hit by some of the worst aerial bombardments since this war began. Those air defense systems you mentioned, once again severely tested. Remember, Aaron, systems that have had to adapt every step of the way over the course of the last year.
It's a pity that I didn't shoot down 3. It's a shame that 2 got through. They hit civilian targets or critical infrastructure facilities and people work there.
These are Ukrainian drone hunters, and day and night they scan the skies, eyes in the backs of their heads. Their machine gun loaded onto an armored vehicle, trading warmth for agility.
The trajectories of the missiles and drones are constantly changing, which means that stationary units were not enough, so we created mobile ones.
Most nights, this is what the skies above Ukraine look and sound like. And more than a year into the war, all that Western equipment is helping. On Wednesday night, over 90 missiles and 8 Shahed drones were detected. Of those, more than 30 missiles and 4 Shaheeds were intercepted, says the Ukrainian military. Here in the frontline town of Kupiansk, you can see what more than a year of heavy artillery and mortar fire have done. It was again the case on Wednesday night. There's not much air defense can do about that. On the whole, what the Ukrainian military says is that with Western help, its air defense systems have actually been remarkably efficient, and from the very start of the invasion.
If this hadn't happened, we would probably not be talking to you now, and there would be no such country as Ukraine. Thanks to the Air Force, we really managed to hold the keys to the sky.
This is a rare close-up look at Iran's technology of death. A Shahed drone, relatively intact for having been fished out of the Black Sea. At its head, it would have carried 50 kilograms worth of explosives. This is what 20 kilograms looks like. And this is what that looks like on the ground. Part of Russia's devastating war of attrition, with civilian casualties on most nights, way beyond the front lines of the east. And Aaron, beyond the direct casualties that I mentioned there are, of course, all the indirect casualties. We're only just getting power restored here to the wider Kharkiv region. In Kharkiv city, there hasn't been power since those overnight strikes from Wednesday to Thursday. That means people, no electricity, no water, nothing to wash and clean with for all that time. And that's part of this war of attrition, Aaron.
Absolutely. Melissa, thank you very much there in reporting all of that. I want to bring in now the former U.S. ambassador to Russia, John Sullivan. And Ambassador, you saw there Melissa standing with that drone and the payload of the drone, as she was showing you sort of what half of a payload would look like, but we're talking about 110 pounds. That's the payload there. In the context of the reporting here that Ukraine is saying that Russia's used 40% of its highest end missiles, the Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, 6 in yesterday's attack alone. Why would Putin use so many of his best missiles in one attack at this point?
Well, thanks, Aaron. Good to be with you. When they use a missile like the Kinzhal, which can't be intercepted by the Ukrainians, that means they definitely want to hit the target they're aiming at. They don't want to run a risk that the missile that's heading for that target is going to be intercepted. The trade-off they make is that it's a very expensive and sophisticated weapon system, which is why the Ukrainians can't intercept it. Why in yesterday's attack? This was payback for what happened in Russia last week, when elements crossed the border from Ukraine into Russia and launched an attack.
So today, Prigozhin, the Wagner Group chief, of course, announced he's opening these new recruitment centers across Russia, dozens of them, 8 in Moscow alone, which, of course, as I mentioned, is home to Russia's elite, the wealthier citizens, really has not sent many soldiers to the front lines, although someone was telling me the other day that sometimes now you go down in the subways and there are people waiting to talk to men and to bring them, to mobilize them. Does this move the needle at all, this sort of recruiting, these recruitment centers?
In my opinion, absolutely not. This move indicates that Prigozhin's prior recruitment efforts in another area, the Russian prisons, have been closed off to him. Russian men know how, if they wanted to volunteer for Wagner had already opened a headquarters in St. Petersburg. People know how to volunteer for Wagner. This is more publicity for Prigozhin. He's making these types of statements every day.
Do you think he's like existentially threatened in any way? I mean, I know there's been this ongoing fight between him and the regular military, but he's saying he has no ammo, can't get in touch with anybody. Nobody will take his calls. Go ahead.
You call the Minister of Defense and the Chief of the General Staff traitors. I'm not surprised no one will take his calls in the Russian military establishment.
So earlier this week, I spoke with a Russian journalist, and he had some really strong reporting, exclusive look at Putin's lavish life with his reputed girlfriend, the former Russian Olympic gold medalist, Alina Kabaeva. Roman Badanin is the reporter, and he shared these pictures of, reportedly, of Putin's home. He said that's the exterior in Valdai, and he also had the interiors decked out in gold, all sorts of different rooms, and he was showing us all of this. Now, Kabaeva's mansion's about half a mile away. If this is the way Putin lives, and we understand that he may still be spending a lot of time there, do you think Putin's lifestyle has been affected by the war or not, Ambassador?
Well, I mean, from what we've seen, his lifestyle has been affected in the following sense, Aaron. He can't travel by air anywhere close to in southwestern Russia. In getting to Sochi, for example, one of his most favorite places to go, he can't travel there by air. He's now traveling more by train. He's concerned about his own safety. As for the economic impacts, if the question is more about supporting his lavish lifestyle, I don't think that's as much of a concern as concerns about his own safety.
As concerns about his own safety. But amazing on that issue of the actual lifestyle itself, with all of the sanctions we hear about, you think that would be verily untouched at this point?
I would think so. I mean, if money's going to go to anybody in that system, it's going to the guy at the top. and he's got plenty of it. And the Russian people themselves are aware of this. They've seen through Navalny's organization the $1 billion palace he's got in Sochi. So this isn't a surprise to anyone either. But it's very interesting to see the photographs you referred to and to see it actually documented.
Yeah, it certainly is. There's some great reporting by Mr. Bannon and his team. All right, thank you so much, Ambassador Sullivan. I appreciate your time.